What's good in the YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here bringing another video. This video is on Lupinranger versus Patoranger episode 25. This episode is called Make It the Strongest, and this episode was pretty good overall. It did lead to Lupinrangers and Patorangers working together in some way, though it wasn't the way that people were hoping, where the two teams would actually learn of each other's identities. Obviously, the Lupinrangers know of the Patorangers' identity, but the Patorangers do not know of the Lupinrangers' identity. As far as things go, what does end up happening in this episode is that it starts off with us seeing that, previously Lyman ended up defeating the Power Rangers and Noel in battle after Lyman turned big, and he was able to turn big on his own without Medoche. What does end up happening, or Goche, whatever. What does end up happening is that eventually from here, the Ganglers are pretty impressed, especially DeGranio, about how he was able to go up against the against the humans and do pretty well, and so he's very curious to see how he'll do later on in battle, and he knows that with Lyman he can actually destroy entire planets, so he could be a real threat to the humans. So he wants to see what will happen with Lyman. Eventually, what we do end up seeing with the Power Rangers is that they're pretty badly injured, and they don't know where Noel is. Noel had gotten injured the most, and what happens is that we end up seeing later on that Noel is sleeping in a bed in the cafe, and he actually ends up getting up, finding a picture of Kyrie when he was a kid with his older brother. Kyrie arrives in the room and is like, "You should stop snooping." And what happens is that eventually at that point Noel mentions that he knows about what happened to his brother. And the thing is that he basically says, "Yes, Kagori told me about what happened to the three of you and those you lost." And he says, "I do want to assemble the collection and help you." And the thing is that Kyrie still doesn't really trust Noel to the extent that he can really trust what he's saying. He kind of is a little bit untrusting right now, and he kind of sees their relationship as more of taking advantage of each other in different situations rather than forming a connection that's strong and stable. So that's important to note. What does end up happening eventually is that we end up seeing Lyman confronting Zamigo. Zamigo is asked by Lyman to join forces because Lyman knows that Zamigo has a Lupin Collection ability that's stronger than his, and he could easily defeat him. So he wants to have this stronger ally on his hands, but he knows that Zamigo is not going to be so easy to work with, and isn't going to instantly say, "I'm going to join forces with you." So that's important to note. What does end up happening though is that eventually the Zamigo ends up transforming into his Gangler form, his monster form, and begins to fight Lyman. This leads to him Lyman being spotted. The Power Rangers end up heading off to find out because Carter ends up hearing about it. Agent the robot Carter or whatever ends up picking it up on a signal. What does end up happening from here though is that the Power Rangers arrive on the scene, as well as the Lupin Rangers end up finding out from Kagori that Lyman's location is where it is, and what happens is that the Power Rangers end up fighting against Lyman and also Zamigo. Zamigo ends up retreating fairly quickly, but then Lyman fights against the Power Rangers. The Power Rangers try several different attacks, even some group attacks. Doesn't really work. What does end up happening though is that the Power Rangers end up discovering that when they do certain attacks, when they really do some real damage, it actually leads to him healing. So part of his Lupin Collection ability is to heal himself, and so they need to remove the Lupin Collection item in order to actually do some real damage to him. So what does end up happening is that eventually they're beaten up pretty badly. Noel arrives on the scene. He transforms into Lupin X, and he decides to do a major attack and rushes in. he uses his special phone device that he's used before to kind of analyze the gold safe. Now that's the one thing that we still were unclear as to how to open those gold safes. And what we end up learning from Noel after he scans it, because he does this to risk his life for learning this information, is that when he eventually is knocked back a huge distance, he ends up confronting Kyrie and the others because they arrive on the scene, and he explains to them that the data that he uncovered showed that the way to open the gold safes is to use 2 versus vehicles. That's the only way you can open the gold safes, and that's something that's very important to note. So in other words, the standard ones only 1 versus vehicle, but with the gold saves 2. So I'm curious if there will be 3 and so on and so forth. And the reason why that is because with each of the versus vehicles there's 3-digit numbers. So in other words, you have to have a 6-digit code in order to open up a gold safe, rather than a 3-digit code for a silver or the basic safe that they typically open up. What does end up happening is that eventually Noel mentions the fact that he does have someone that he's fighting for as well, and he wants to get back. And the thing is that this basically shows that he does understand him more. The thing is that Kyrie doesn't trust him completely. He trusts him as a thief, and he also trusts him in the sense is that he knows that he's going to put his life on the line, and he'll take bigger risks. So he's not just someone that's just in it to mess around or anything like that. Like, he became a thief for similar reasons to why they are thieves. So there is that similarity and connection. What does end up happening as well is that eventually Kyrie and the others head in. They end up fighting. Kyrie plans to act as a distraction so that Toma and Umika can head in and use their versus vehicles to open up his gold safe. What happens is, though, when Kyrie tries to act as a diversion and then Umika and Toma try to work together, it doesn't work out because he's on to them and he knows what they're going to do. And then what happens is that Kyrie realizes, okay, I guess I'm going to have to handle this myself, and he ends up using his Kaito boost. And what happens is that he ends up having to use the scissors and blade dial fighters. And what happens is that as he's using them, eventually Noel arrives on the scene. After what happens is that actually before that, the Power Rangers, specifically Tsukasa, decides we need to take advantage of the situation and work alongside the Lupinrangers. Even though they may not be someone that we typically would associate with, we need to take advantage of the situation, and we know the only way that we're going to be able to defeat Lyman is if we work together with them. So they end up putting aside their differences for this one battle, and what happens is that they end up working together. The Lupinrangers end up using their versus vehicles to have their big chain or whatever to pull on the arms of Lyman from both ends, and at the same time Sakuya and Tsukasa are helping they're helping out the other team. So for example, Tsukasa is helping out Umika, and Sakuya is helping out Toma. In the meantime, Kichiro ends up helping out as well by pulling on Lyman's leg and trying to hold him down. And the thing is that Kichiro is the one that's fighting back the most against the Lupinrangers. In fact, in reality, if it weren't for him, this situation would probably be much easier, but he has to put his differences aside because he especially is the one that's fighting back against the Lupinrangers. But what does end up happening is that Kyrie heads in, Noel arrives as well, and the two of them end up using versus vehicles. Noel actually caches a Cyclone dial fighter that actually falls out of Kyrie's hands, and what happens is that the two of them go in, they use the two dial fighters on the gold safe, and they open it up, and it's revealed to be the Lupin collection item, which is actually taken from the design of the Techno Brace, I believe, from Liveman. So that's pretty cool. And then what happens is that eventually Lineman ends up turning big. At that point, what happens is that the two teams fight. Well, specifically, Kairi and Kichiro end up fighting over using Good Striker. At first, Kichiro wants to use it, but then Kairi's like, well, you guys lost when you fought, so maybe we should try this time. And they keep on fighting back and forth, grabbing it. Tsukasa ends up pushing back Kichiro, and Kairi ends up pushing... not Kairi. Umaka pushes away Kairi so that they're separated from each other. And then what happens is that Noelle gets in the middle, and what happens is that at that point Good Striker is flying in the air, and he basically says, we're going to combine forces this time so that none of you guys fight. And so what happens is that at this point they end up forming Good Cool Kaiser VSX, which is the combination that features the three main dial fighters, the three main trigger machines, the four trains from what do you call it, X Emperor, so the X Thunder, the X Fire, and then the silver and the gold train. All of those combined with Good Striker as well, so that's 11 different mechas combining into one big mecha called Good Cool Kaiser VSX. VSX has to do with the fact that it's versus, and then the X has to do with like X Emperor, so it's the combination of all of these things together into one big mecha. Initially, when it was first revealed what it looked like, it looked really ugly to me. It's not the best design in general. When you see it as a actual toy, it's very questionable. In action, it actually looks a lot cooler. Just seeing some of the shots and the footage that we actually get to see with this new mecha combination is very, very cool. It's really done well, seeing all these mechas and how they function, especially with like with Tsukasa, with Umaka and Toma's mechas, like how they end up being used is really awesome. And then the arms for the X trains is actually pretty cool as well. There's just a lot of really good footage in this battle, and what we also end up seeing is that the cockpit works in a very different way from how it typically works when you have such a big team. Typically with big teams, they actually have them all together. In this case, what they actually do is that they separate it into three cockpits. So there's the main cockpit, which features Lupin X or Patoranger X in the middle. And then on the sides, the ideal situation is to have Lupin Red and Patoranger Ichigo together. That initially is what happens, and then the other ones are Lupin Blue and Lupin Yellow in another set, and then Patoranger, Nigo, and Sango in another cockpit. What does end up happening is that they end up fighting, and at first, Kichiro wants to take the charge, but what happens is that Kairi's like, you always seem to be wanting to call the shots, and eventually Good Striker, which by the way ends up having a new form to his look, rather than having the police hat or having the thief look, like with the wizard hat, with like the magic hat or whatever, he actually ends up having a crown. And what happens is that in this case, he actually decides to switch Kichiro out for Tsukasa, because he knows that Tsukasa will actually work with Kairi, as opposed to Kichiro, who doesn't seem to be getting along, at least right now, with Kairi, which is expected because he's the one that's the most against working with the Lupinrangers in general. So that whole thing happens. We see lots of cool fighting, and eventually they do manage to defeat Lyman. Following this, what does end up happening is that we end up seeing that Degranio was impressed with his abilities and how he was able to do pretty well against the Lupinrangers and Patorangers. But what this also leads to is him saying, now I'm going to have to reconsider a number of things because of the fact that they were able to defeat Lyman. Which basically, which if I could, figure out what that means, I'm pretty sure what he's basically implying is that he thought, oh, well, since they were able to defeat that, I'm going to need to step up my game with someone that's really a lot stronger because I thought maybe Lyman might be able to take them out, but clearly they're strong enough to deal with that threat. So this is kind of an interesting point to consider, that he's clearly having to realize now he can't just mess around. He has to get some real serious ganglers involved in the future. So that's an important thing to consider. Now, as far as things go otherwise, what we do end up seeing is that eventually Noelle wants to stay in the Lupinranger's base, and the thing is that they say, don't you have a home? And he says, yes, I do, but chores are boring and it gets lonely. And then he ends up asking each of the Lupinrangers if they would join him for a certain time since he's hurt. But what happens is that the Lupinrangers basically explain, if you understand how we work, we basically do only what's necessary for each other. We're not a group of people that will be just assisting you no matter what. So in other words, they end up saying, you should maybe ask one of the Patorangers, because then they'll actually help you. And so what does end up happening is that there's a lot of fighting and silliness that ends up occurring, and the episode pretty much ends there. As far as things go with the preview for the next episode, what we do end up seeing is that we will be seeing the Cyclone night form for Lupin Kaiser, with ex-Emperor fighting against a Gangler. The story, it looks like, will have some sort of fake relationship occurring between fake romance with a wedding possibly, with Tsukasa and Noelle, which is very, very common in Sentai. There's several seasons where the sixth member of the team, or it's typically, there's no constant, but I would say a lot of times it's either red and pink, or whoever's the special ranger for the team tends to have some sort of fake wedding episode where we see them dressed up very nice and they put on this gag to get into a situation where they end up dealing with a Gangler. Again, that's what I can assume from from the preview, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where things will go. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to know you guys' opinions of this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye, guys.